Good evening and welcome. On behalf of the Leo Beck Institute London, I'm very pleased to welcome you to this online roundtable on the Kindertransport, which we are holding in collaboration with the British-German Association. We are delighted to have three exceptional speakers with us this evening, each approaching the history and legacy of the Kindertransport from a different perspective. Dr. Amy Williams is the Kindertransport Scholar in Residence at the Association of Jewish Refugees. She is a distinguished historian of Holocaust memory and migration and has devoted more than a decade to researching the Kindertransport and its historical and contemporary significance. Howard Falksohn is senior archivist at the Wiener Holocaust Library, where he has played a major role in a number of important archival initiatives, including the projects The Gathering Storm and Testifying to the Truth. And Dr. Monja Stahlberger is postdoctoral research associate on the Nation of Refuge research project at the University of Reading. Her work examines exile and migration in 20th century Europe, with a particular focus on German and Austrian refugees and on the role of ego documents in shaping experiences of displacement, memory, and identity. So the format of this evening's event will be quite straightforward. Each of our speakers will offer a short initial contribution, after which we will move into a discussion among the panel before opening the conversation to questions from the audience. Please feel free to type your questions into the chat at any point during the event. I will gather these and read them out during the Q&A towards the end of the session. Before we begin, I'm very pleased to hand over to Dr. Tamara Abela from the British-German Association, who will say a few words on behalf of our partner organization.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. It's such a pleasure to be here tonight, and I'd really just like to say a heartfelt thank you to the Leo Baeck Institute London, who is such a great and wonderful partner of ours, and they've done an incredible job to bring this event together. And we are delighted to collaborate with them and hope this will be one of many collaborations. And it's, yeah, we are delighted that so many people are in the audience tonight. And I just want to say, enjoy the evening and thank you.
So I think we hand over to Dr. Amy Williams.
Gosh, thank you so much for having us this evening. I'm going to begin before my talk to sort of sum up British memory of the Kindertransport over the past however many years, and also how our sort of talks connect with one another. So if we could share the PowerPoint, please, and we'll do a whistle-stop tour, and then I'll talk about my research. Wonderful. So, as I said, this is a very whistle-stop tour. It does not include everything. So, British memory of the Kindertransport, we can say, sort of really begins in the post-war period, and it is very positive. It's a lot of testimony, as Monja will talk about later, is used to sort of bolster the claim that the refugee organisations were doing their best. And then after this sort of very early period, memory is sort of forgotten. But the survivors obviously themselves have private reunions that aren't always necessarily public, but they have these small reunions into the post-war period. And then it looks like memory is really heading in a more complex and transnational direction because of the first sort of autobiographies that we are presented with, and particularly collective autobiographies. We can see a real broadening of the understanding of the definition and of what the Kindertransport means. And then pretty much in the 80s and 90s, when the Kinder have these first larger reunions, that's where we see memory of the Kindertransport become more publicly known. And then into the early 2000s, and for many different reasons, which I don't have time to go into now, memory sort of goes in a very national, celebratory, congratulatory way, and we can talk about that why later. And then I would argue in the last 5 to 10 years, memory is becoming more self-critical. It is moving in a new direction, that whether that be remembering other parts of the UK, so regional memories becoming more discussed. We could also think about cross-border collaborations. We could think about this critical turn, listening to the survivors' voices more. But I would argue we are at a sort of crossroads now. We could go down this more national route with more self-criticism, or start to see a more opening up of memory to becoming more transnational, incorporating other national narratives into our national narrative. So thinking about German and Austrian memory and how they impact our national memory in Britain. But I would also argue, because of recent events, sadly, there has also been an attack on Kindertransport memory, and I would even go as far to say even an eradication or a blinding or a reevaluation of history as well. So we're in a really interesting area as we're approaching the 90th anniversary in a couple of years' time. Next slide, please. Thank you. So just quickly how all our talks are connected this evening. So we are all looking at archives. Monja and Howard are very privileged to work in archives. I only visit them. We're looking at different material and how this combines with one another. We're looking at, as we said, personal, local, regional, national, and transnational memories. We're looking at how different generations remember. We're going to be looking at new histories, new discoveries. And there's so many stories. We know so many Kindertransport stories and testimony that's out there, but there's still a lot of survivors that we're still interviewing now. And yet we're all committed to presenting and preserving Kindertransport memory. And towards the end of the talk, we might look at what the future looks like. There's still so much more to uncover. We're going to look at the interconnectedness of the archive, and we're going to start off from a broader perspective into a more personal one. So that's a very quick whistle-stop tour of where we are in the field at the moment. And next slide, please. Lovely. So for my part, we're going to be looking at how all these different archives connect with one another and how they're presenting not necessarily a new history of the Kindertransport, but a more broader one. So I've looked in about 250,000 files at the moment, and the documents that I've been looking at are Kindertransport lists and chaperone lists, and the term Kindertransport is first used in 1934. So I'm looking at Kindertransport and what that means from 34 up until 42, sorry. Obviously, our version of the Kindertransport, the British version, is 1938 to 1940. We also have youth Aliyah lists, we have Kitchener camp lists and case files of Kinder whose parents, were in Kitchener and they're trying to get them out. We have internment lists, so Kinder that arrive as refugees and then who are interned as enemy aliens. We have those lists. And then tragically, after the Val d'Hiv roundup and before that Wannsee, the Nazis and the officials used the term Kindertransport to refer to the deportation of children. So we also have specific use of the term in a very different context to mean the deportation of children, and we have Kindertransport lists there as well. And some of those children who obviously had escaped to France or Belgium or other places were then tragically deported on Kindertransports. That is not to say all the deportation of children were through Kindertransports, but this was, and the Nazis particularly discussed this. Also in the Eichmann trial, the use of the Kindertransport, that is the first use of the term in the post-war period, and it means deportation. We have post-war lists, so these are children who have survived the camps and who are coming over after the war. We have lists of Kindertransports that never took place. There's a lot of lists like this. We have case files and letters that Monja will talk about as well. We have a lot of ferry information. We've just had access to some of the first Harwich arrival lists. We have government records. There's even a Kindertransport to Ethiopia. A lot of committee files. There's incredible files at the Wiener Library that discuss the larger movement of children even before Kristallnacht. We have newspapers. As Monja will go on to say, she'll talk about ego documents, but we can also now, for the first time, really connect ego documents and the Kindertransport list themselves. We have all documentation around Evian and the Pollen Action, which some of the Kinder were part of. We have Gestapo files. Every child that went on the Kindertransport would have had a Gestapo file, and we have those. Not all of them, but some of them. We have the Kinder Service Army records, and we have hostel records and financial records. And just as an interesting note on the financial records, we have some of the prices of some of the Kindertransports from Vienna, and one Kindertransport from Vienna, and this was help from a lot of friends, not me, was in today's money about £78,000. And when we sort of looked at that costing just for one transport in today's money, and then sort of looked at all the other transports, you could argue that it would probably be around 3 million in today's money. That's how much the Kindertransport costs to come just to Britain. This is something that we're still working on, but those are sort of figures that we can now sort of say, because we have more awareness of the other documentation that's out there. Next slide, please. So with the documents that we found, we can now bring other versions of the Kindertransport back into Kindertransport memory. So for example, these terms that you see on the screen now all mean Kindertransport. They were all used during the time to refer to the Kindertransport. You can see the linguistic complexity here as well. So obviously we can see that Kindertransport memory is not just a British thing, but something more transnational. We could also think about all those what if Kindertransports, those Kindertransports that didn't happen. All those children can now be brought back into Kindertransport memory as well, because we were able to remember those names. And as I said, there are other versions of the Kindertransport that we can talk about within Kindertransport memory now. And final slide, please. So we're going to be thinking about throughout the talk whether Kindertransport memory just simultaneously is out there. Does it just exist in all these countries, or is there a cross-border flow? Is there something which connects them all? And the new book that I'm working on with the AJR and Professor Bill Niven is looking at contextually and temporarily rethinking what the Kindertransport is through the documentation itself, not necessarily through our ideas, but through what the documents tell us. And what is interesting, we'll be able to dispel a lot of myths. So, for example, adults were rescued by the Kindertransport. So many chaperones were able to stay because they had visas. For example, we could also think about how parents who got out on the Kindertransport but their children remained in continental Europe. Some of those adults journeyed on the same ferries as some of the Kinder. We just found out one story today. The records of the lists as well are so important because we really want to capture people's reactions to the list, these emotional reactions. So the records are a confirmation, affirmation of what happened, but we also want to understand what the second and third generation make of these lists now. And I purposely use this photo because it's not just about memory, it's also about the living survivors. And just as a promo from work, if any of you do know first generation who need any financial help, please be in touch with the AJR because there is potential funding out there for you. And the Kinder, we're talking about memorialization and memory, and this is something that wouldn't have happened without them. And the survivors are still so central to this. We might also think about museum techniques that conceal, hide, or emphasize stories and memories of the Kindertransport. We've had to rely so much on Kindertransport testimony itself because a lot of these documents were not known. And now we can really move towards a combination of the archive and the personal to really show a more complex and nuanced understanding of the Kindertransport. And just to sort of wrap up then, I would still say the definition and symbolism of the Kindertransport in Britain is still very narrow. It is broadening up. It is a sort of, I would argue, a time to reassess where memory is at and where we're going now. And we can do that through different theories. We can do that through different ways of studying the Kindertransport. And obviously, hopefully for the 90th anniversary of the AJR, we'll also be presenting a new Kindertransport database. So thank you.
Thank you, Amy. I'm just going to take over here. So yeah, if you could move on the slide, please. Yeah, you've beautifully set the scene here. And I just wanted to thank you and Howard as well for these really, really like interesting discussions that we have before this talk, because it's been great to see how our work complements each other and feeds into each other, because you're coming from this more of like a historian and archive perspective. I'm coming from this as a literary scholar from German studies. Who's been interested in Igor documents. So you can really see like the different disciplines that come together in Kindertransport research. But that's just as a side note. So as Amy has already beautifully said, we need official documents, but also Igor documents to make sense of the bigger picture. And I just wanted to give you a brief overview of the value of looking at these early documents to further understand the Kindertransport experience to Britain and what it means not only to the child refugees themselves, but also to Britain as a nation. So when we study the Kindertransport, presumably a good starting point is always to look at what can be counted, the trains, numbers of children, departure dates, etc. But as we've just heard, these documents are far from complete and not discovered yet. But we are uncovering more and more. So the further we move into the 20th century, we need these kind of documents. We'll rely on these institutional records, but also on the Igor documents that the children left behind to continue our investigation into the rescue mission, its impact and legacy. And next slide, please. And by Igor documents, I mean diaries, letters and memoirs, but also school essays, notebooks, scraps of personal writing, and even oral history that have been created by the Kindertransport refugees themselves. And this little diagram is far from complete what entails Igor documents, but just to give you an idea. And I think that especially the early testimonies and Igor documents are sources that bring us closer to hearing the children's own voices and thoughts at the time. So early documents can show us their immediate reactions, whereas the later Igor documents and testimonies show more reflection and memory work. And together, both of these kind of documents reveal how memory evolves, not just individually, but also collectively and over time, for the Kindertransport refugees themselves, but also for Britain as a nation. So why look at these Igor documents in the first place? As we've heard, traditional archives surrounding the Kindertransport that include official lists, correspondence of aid agencies, etc., are incomplete in many cases. And it's exactly in those gaps where Igor documents come in that were created by the Kindertransport refugees themselves. So they're not just substitutes, but they're essential resources to understand the experience. And here I mean a broad variety of Igor documents. So not just the diaries and letters that we have from the early years, but also just basically all their like life documents, like over a bigger time span. And they show the lived experience behind the administrative categories, revealing how children navigated displacement in ways that cannot be reconstructed from official files alone. And they also show us how memory works in itself, what is remembered when, how, and where. And as my work is primarily focused on diaries, I will briefly highlight their potential. So coming back to the gaps which we're trying to fill with the Igor documents, thinking about diaries, I just wanted to point out a couple of things. So the diarists, for example, also write about other children that were on their transports or in their accommodation, or they write about air raids or further evacuation to the countryside, which might be missing in some files. We might not have these files. And they also write about simple everyday interaction, family life and host families, or activities they do. They might write about an argument with a foster sibling, or receiving a pen for Christmas, going to particular religious services, and so on and so far. And these things, as I said, might not be found in official documents. And all these perhaps mundane writings, alongside their retelling of their experiences of war and displacement, brings the children's own voices into focus. And this is especially important in discourses on child migration and refuge now as well, because we can take what we can read there and like apply it to discourses nowadays surrounding migration and refuge. And why is that? Because we shouldn't regard the children as passive, but also as having some form of agency, even within particular constraints of migration, refuge, and exile. So it's often easy to generalize and assume that children were passive recipients of care or victims of geopolitical circumstances. Particularly the early writings, however, show how misleading that assumption can be. The diarists express agency in various ways. For example, they show emotion. Children often expressed homesickness, confusion, or resentment, but also joy and hope. One particular example that comes to my mind is from a diary written by Elisabeth Orsten, aged 12, held at the Holocaust Memorial Museum, where she writes about singing a German folk song during a walk through the English countryside and then bursting into tears. And I think her diary beautifully captures that complexity of longing and also adaptation of coming to terms with her new situation. And this might have been a moment that was actually in the time important to her to record, but too fleeting to remember later on. Equally meaningful are the silences, the abrupt endings, the missing pages, lists instead of reflections. And here a page of a diary from Fritz Selig's diary held at the Leobeck in New York comes to mind, where he lists the timings of his Kindertransport leaving Berlin. And it may look emotionally empty, but it actually can also be read as an act of emotional management during a time of distress. They also show agency more directly in their ego documents. Writing itself is a form of agency, letter exchanges with family, for example, choosing the language, tone, or even deciding to include some doodles. These are all ways where we can see how the children shape their own narratives. And they also write directly about being involved in trying to help their families to get out of Nazi-occupied Europe. Edith Bauer-Jakobowicz, whose diary is held at the Imperial War Museum, for example, continuously writes about trying to raise money for the visas for her parents by talking to the Jewish community in Belfast. And I'm not saying that all the children and young refugees displayed a similar amount of engagement or agency, but the individual documents show that each and every one came up with their own strategies and practices to negotiate their changing circumstances and life in a different country and coming to terms with the Kindertransport experience. So how does listening or reading the children's own voices help us understand the Kindertransport experience more? While institutional records capture the transnational structures, so arrangements between committees, border documents, sponsorship agreements, etc., like Amy's already shown, children's writing captures the emotional form of transnationalism to some extent. So the longing for the parents, switching between languages, forming new attachments, and negotiating traumatic experience. We can also learn about further journeys, regional experience, and the legacy and impact on their identity. But why do these documents matter now? So the study of ego documents also matters because the Kindertransport continues to occupy a significant place in British public memory. It is often broadly remembered as a story of national generosity and moral clarity, as a moment when Britain did the right thing. So if I talk about my research to someone that I've just met, a lot of people have a very positive image of the Kindertransport. But the children's diaries and letters and other forms of ego documents, as well as the institutional records that we're uncovering, invite a more nuanced understanding and a multi-perspective approach. They show us how the experience was lived from within, revealing moments of both gratitude and struggle, welcome and loneliness, and safety and loss. So by returning to these intimate sources, we can revise how the Kindertransport is mobilised in British culture and complicate the narrative of Britain as a nation of refuge. It's not just a symbol of humanitarian action, but also functions as a lens through which the nation negotiates its identity, its responsibilities, and its storytelling about refuge. The Kindertransporte's writings remind us that the history we think about and commemorate is made up of real children with individual voices and not just abstract heroes and young beneficiaries of care. So ultimately, the most important thing about listening to their own voices is that it allows the Kindertransport refugee children to remain the storytellers of their own lives. And now it's my pleasure to hand over to Howard. And I forgot to say next slide, so you will see a slide briefly and then.
Thank you very much, Monja and Amy. There's a lot of resonances in what you just said there, Monja, in my talk. So, as the archivist at the Wiener Library for more than 25 years, I've come across a lot of material on the subject of the Kindertransport. This includes primary sources such as original diaries and letters from former Kinder, committee meeting minutes, correspondence and reports from relief agencies involved in the organisation and reception of children, also published and unpublished memoirs, academic studies, audiovisual materials, photographs, and plenty of secondary literature. It's a subject for which the library has a lot of coverage, and it's a subject which has understandably generated a lot of interest amongst our readership and our users. As the son of a former child who came on the Kindertransport in 1939 from Berlin, I also have a personal interest in the subject matter. I'll spend the following few minutes making a few observations and sharing a few anecdotal accounts, partly based on my own family's experience and partly on the product of my engagement with Wiener Library content. The experiences of Kindertransport children are as varied and nuanced as the number of former Kinder. Take Bertha Leviton's own story. Bertha Leviton was responsible for the incredibly successful reunions of former Kindertransport children, which began in 1989, 50 years after the events themselves. About 1,000 of the original circa 10,000 children attended the first event. Bertha deposited her files from this project with the library, which comprised 166 personal accounts of former Kinder, some book length. She also produced and published the accounts I Came Alone, containing more testimonies, including her own. In fact, her own story is one of misery, exploitation, and abuse at the hands of those who were supposed to look after her. Similarly, Jennifer Craig Norton, in the Kindertransport Contesting Memory, explodes the myth that the story of the Kindertransport is one of seamless rescue by well-intentioned organisations into the hands of kind-hearted British families who went on to nurture what became well-adjusted, loved and cared for young adults. Of course, there were great success stories, and in fact, as we speak, I'm working on the records of the Bunce Court School, which produced some incredibly accomplished individuals, former Kinder, who went on to become variously winning, prize-winning scientists, world-famous artists, captains of industry, leading academics, etc. It's no surprise, however, that we are less likely to hear the stories of those who weren't successful, or worse still, had negative experiences which would affect them for the rest of their lives. My own father's life wasn't exactly unsuccessful, especially given the complete absence of any education from the age of 13. But the ultimate sacrifices of his parents and his subsequent forced separation was something he never appreciated or understood at the time, nor fully recovered from his entire life. I've tried to imagine what it must have been like for him to have been sent away without fully comprehending his parents' motives. His father couldn't bring himself to say goodbye at the station. They never saw each other again. To be put on a train with strangers, to sail on a ferry across the sea for the first time, to arrive in a foreign country where he didn't know anyone and he couldn't speak one word of the language, to have no idea about his future, what would happen to him that evening, that next day, let alone next month or the years ahead, whether he could ever see his parents again. But he was alive, no doubt saved from certain death. Great Britain was only supposed to be a staging post. He was selected for inclusion on the Kindertransport programme on the basis that he would join his older sister on a kibbutz where she'd settled in 1934. The outbreak of World War II prevented his further emigration, and like many of his cohort on a similar pathway, he remained in Great Britain, which became his home and which he grew to love. Incredibly, the Wiener Library happens to hold some records of the institution where my dad stayed for 18 months, along with some 150 other adolescents from Berlin, Prague, and Vienna. Bydown House was a stately Georgian pile in North Devon which had known better days. The Jewish Refugee Committee took over the part derelict building in late 1939 to house refugee youngsters from Central Europe with the intention of preparing them for kibbutz life in Palestine. Amongst them were at least 20 youths who came on the Nicholas Winton trains. In reality, while some of the youth leaders, the Medrichim, made it to Palestine, most of the residents never got there. The Wiener Library holds a collection of papers formerly in the possession of one of the youth leaders, Fred Dunstan, also known as Fritz Deutsch, which document in part some of the organisational issues and also, importantly, material produced by some of the residents, the Chavarim, the Chavarot themselves. Lack of funding, poor communication between the head office in London and the centre in Devon, inadequate organisation, hurried selection, absence of preparation, intersign rivalries between the various organisations, the Chabonim, Chechalut, Beta, etc., all contributed to what was ultimately a doomed project. The centre was closed down after only 18 months, and the residents were either selected to go to other centres or started to live independently in London and elsewhere, which is the case of my father. When my dad died in 2011, I got access to the file produced by his welfare officer. These files were administered by World Jewish Relief, formerly the Central British Fund for the Relief of German Jewry. The file is relatively thin in content. It documents mostly a period of several years after his arrival in London, where from the age of 15 he lived in various hostels and bed-sitting accommodation. He only seemed to meet his welfare officer when he was running out of cash. Unlike many of the families of Kindertransport children who I've met over the years at the library, our family doesn't possess the correspondence which I know Dad received from his parents. He didn't retain any of the letters. So his life and that of his family during this period is relatively undocumented. That said, one day in 2008, on a visit to relatives in Israel, I discovered a small cache of letters at my cousin's house, which included letters which my father in London had written to his sister in Palestine. One letter in particular offered a rare but important insight into his life as a young refugee teenager in London during the Blitz. It's apparent that he hadn't written for a long time because he'd been depressed, and only after 3 years did he feel confident enough to put pen to paper. He mentions the periods of loneliness and boredom. The overall impression from this letter is of a teenager who, after 3 years in the host country, is finally coming to terms with his situation, confident enough to express himself and discuss his feelings with his older sister, of whom he was very fond but wouldn't see for another 20 years. He was no longer a Kindertransportee, but a resident and in due course a proud citizen of Great Britain. Now, I've got a few slides I was going to show you, images from my family archive. The first one here depicts my father there, third from the right, shortly before he was sent away. For me, it's a very poignant image because his father, third from the left, who he never saw again, I know he's lost a lot of weight in that picture. And his sister next to him also looked kind of drawn and probably weighed down by the burden of what's going to happen to them. His mother is to the left of my father, and he finally hooked up with her about 25 years after the war. There's my dad's kind of grinning and, apparently oblivious to the gravity of the situation, holding a chicken and laughing at the same time. For me, it's quite a poignant picture. Next one, please. That's him shortly after he arrived on the Kindertransport, and I think that's from his file actually at the World Jewish Relief. The next one, please. That's my dad's sister. in 1934 but in Charlottenburg, Berlin, shortly before she made Aliyah. And it was on the basis of her uh, going to Palestine that he was allowed to come to Great Britain. And the next one, please. And that's a very rare picture taken, I have to say, from Helen Fry's book, The Jews of North Devon. And there's a chapter on Bydown in there. So that's a picture of Bydown House. And there's some of the young people. And the chap on the left there is actually my dad, which I was amazed to come across that in a published book. It's the only picture I've got of him in Bydown. So that's a very important image for me as well. So that's gratitude to Helen Fry and the Jews of North Devon for that picture. And finally, the last slide is my dad and his sister finally meet up in the 60s. She came over, my aunt Tutta, she came over a number of times before she finally passed away in the 90s. And my dad only ever got to Israel just when she was dying. It's quite sad, but he did actually finally get there. But they were very close. When she came over, they used to always speak German together, and they were very close despite being separated for all those years. So that's it. That's my story. Thank you.
Well, thank you to all three of you for yeah, e three excellent contributions. So much to take in there. So many possible questions, and I think some people have already started posing questions in the chat, so we will get onto those quite soon. Just before we do give you an opportunity to sort of discuss some of your themes amongst yourselves, one of the questions that came to my mind, obviously this identity of being a Kindertransportee is something that these refugees take with them throughout their lives. But how important, I mean, obviously it varies, but how important is it throughout uh, the lifespan of a Kindertransportee? How does it change? How do they relate to British society? It seems to me that they form a distinct sort of subgroup, a small group, but nonetheless with a very clear and powerful shared experience. So, if any of you have reflections on that, I'd be very happy to hear them. Howard.
Yeah, I think it may depend on the age of the children because the age range, if you are very young, I mean, I've come across a number of donors of document collections at the library whose parents or grandparents came over when they were very young, so they lost all their German and they had no real kind of cultural identity with the country they left from. So they didn't have the language. They in their memories may have been very kind of misty and not very clear. Whereas then you get the much older age group, like the chaperones that Amy was talking about, and the ones maybe slightly younger, well, they were sort of, borderline adults. And so they were very, integrated into German culture, and German was their first language. And so for them, I guess the loss of would have been a lot greater for the older age group. The younger age group, depending how, positive their experience was coming over. But also I suppose there's the element of separation from their families, which must have been traumatic. So I think the age range of the children is a factor in the extent to which it was preoccupied them for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, I think let me come in here. I think I agree with Howard that well, let me start by saying it's hard to actually generalize because every person will be different. And this is sort of what I've learned from my research looking at the different histories. Whilst age, gender, further migration, family reunions, they all play a part in it, to sort of like some extent. And like someone who might be reunited with their family will have a happy life, and someone who was reunited with family members will not lead such a happy life. So there's very different nuances, and like I think a lot of people didn't want to speak about it for a very long time. And I think there's also a lot of them out there who were influenced by the positive nature that the Kindertransports were remembered for a very long time. So if they had a bad experience, then like way into adulthood, they would think maybe I'm not allowed to have had this. Like, what was it just me? And then when people started sharing their histories and their experiences, then like actually they realized, oh, we are a community and we have that feeling, and it's actually quite nice. And I think Amy's much more involved in that. So maybe please do come in here now. But I think the community feeling of those who want to be involved is actually really, really lovely.
No, I think you've both touched upon really interesting points. The only other thing I would maybe add is around compensation. So if we think of the claims conference, for example, like that compensation, a specific Kindertransport fund was in 2019. Please correct me if I'm wrong. So in terms of recognizing the Kinder as survivors, it came very late. So I've been in rooms where Kinder have not been called survivors and things like that as well. And I suppose, yeah, really questioning who is a Kindertransportee, particularly with the documents now. So obviously all the Kinder that came on the Kindertransport, they are Kinder. When they feel or don't feel like that's a discussion that Howard and Monica have already entered into. But I'm wondering now the children that had places, who had guarantors, who had already, the deposits had already been paid, but because of the war, and because of illness and other things, other factors that never left on the Kindertransport, are they kinder? To me, they are. They're part of this story, even though they didn't arrive necessarily. They are still part some way of this story. Also the children that were, for example, in France and Belgium and other countries that then were tragically deported, they are kinder first, and then they go on a total different journey after that. So again, the sort of understanding who the Kinder are, we can understand that from our British perspective, but understanding that also from a wider, more transnational perspective as well, I think is interesting.
Thank you. Before I hand over to the audience, I had one more question. We've looked at the sort of the individuals, the Kindertransportees. Now think about British society, uh, both at the time when it received these refugees, but also subsequently. How has the Kindertransport made an impact in British collective memory? What is the legacy of the Kindertransport in British society? Who
I
wants to
think
go first?
I can start, but I think this is much more Amy's wheelhouse. But just to sort of as a side note, this is actually what I'm going to look at for my postdoctoral project now, is like part of the sort of eco document side of their experiences of the child refugees, but also how Britain received them, and also comparing them to other refugee movements like the Basque children coming over or Polish resettlement after the war. But the Kindertransport in some for some reason have taken this like sort of mythical standing for a long time, and it keeps like happening. Like if we think back a few years when One Life came into the cinemas, it was really, really celebrated, and it is a good thing that this is actually coming to the public, and it's like a sort of the more general people will know about it, but it sort of remains this thing of like, oh, look what we've done, but also look now what's happening. Like as Amy said earlier, like we're in a time where things are really hugely complicated, geopolitically speaking, and there's refugees coming in with all the conflict that's happening, and sort of the narrative has shifted. And yes, we've done really good things in the past, but like now it's time to close our borders, for example. Like there is a narrative out there, even if it's a vocal minority, there's people out there arguing, for example, that like, yeah, we've let so many refugees in before, now it's someone else's turn. which is like part of it, I think. But it's a vocal minority, as I said. But yeah, Amy, do you want to come in, or Howard, one of you?
Yeah, just to add to that, I agree with everything that you said. It's interesting with what you were saying with the refugee crisis. I would a sort of other side of that is that we had the term Ukraine transport birthed out of the term Kindertransport, and that was coined by a second generation Kindertransportee. Um, so I suppose we have learnt from Kindertransport history, and we are using memory in a positive way to encourage, to encourage people to act and not sort of rest on their laurels. So, and we've learnt in the sense of, I mean, the Kindertransport it didn't bring families over. The Ukraine transport did at least bring mom. So it kept the family unit together in some sort of capacity. Going back to what Howard said, the Kindertransport was temporary. It's so central and such a cornerstone of British memory of the Holocaust now, which is interesting considering it was only ever meant to be temporary, and the children were always meant to move beyond British shores, and some of them did. Several thousand of them did leave during and after the war. But it's interesting that we've like really claimed this as our own, and rightly we should. I don't want to, suggest that we shouldn't do this and we shouldn't celebrate and remember all the positives. But as everybody else has said in this talk, there are these more complex and more, I suppose, negative stories also to remember. And that's why I think moving to the 90th anniversary with all this beautiful, people out there that are doing all this amazing research, there's so many academics that I can see online as well, and the families themselves who are coming forward and telling us more about their family stories. It's because of all this activity around the Kindertransport. But I think we are heading in a more nuanced and transnational and more self-critical and all those things. I think we are moving in that direction. I would just say it's a slow process. In other countries, the Kindertransport is much more broader. They have a more in-depth understanding of it, and I think we are just considering it is so important to us and it is so central. We are slightly slow on other aspects of Kindertransport history and memory.
Howard, did you want to say anything to this?
I was just thinking, you're talking about the modern refugee crisis, and I was thinking of Lord Dubs, who was actually a former Kindertransportee himself, wasn't he? And he's sort of very active and very involved and very great advocate of providing sanctuary for especially child refugees. And so in a way, he's bringing his own experience to the modern problem of refugees. I was just really kind of following up on what Monja and Amy were saying. But yeah, I mean, it is generally regarded as a very sort of positive, very British of positive bit of British history. But as I've alluded to and others already, it is very nuanced, and you don't really hear the bad story. The negative stories tend to kind of get pushed under the carpet because partly probably because those people don't want to voice them, don't want to make them public, um, and would rather sort of keep a sort of low profile. So it's just worth bearing in mind. If reading Bertha Leviton, her account, that really kind of it came home to me there. It's such a tragic sort of a story, and yet there she was, instrumental in bringing all these former kinder together, and more than once in actual fact. So yeah, that's it.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think it's a huge topic in itself, and I know there has been some criticism, some debate around the British government's role and what it did or didn't do for these refugees. Nonetheless, we have about 25 minutes for audience questions, of which we have already received some in the chat, and I'll work through these. If you want to put yours again, if I miss it, please do that. If you want to speak your question in person, or, through your PC. Please raise your hand virtually, and we'll come and unmute you. But I'll start with some of the ones that have been typed in the chat. One asks, Monja, I'm curious if you found many differences in memories slash emotions when comparing diaries slash letters written as children to oral histories recorded as adults.
Thank you. That's a great question. I have, but I think a lot of that is actually down to what they thought was important to record at the time. Like you have kind of different concerns, and then like the sort of perception of it all shifts later on as well as you contextualize what's happened. Um, so a lot of people like get more critical about the experience, but like when you read the letters and you read the diaries, they were written in the moment. I mean, there's a whole sort of side argument and like discussion on like how reliable are diaries and letters, like when were they written and like all of these kind of things. So, but I'm generalizing here, but they were written in the moment. So like they were on the Kindertransport, not knowing how long they will be there. So for some of them, it might have been exciting. You know, some of them don't even, but then some say, I don't even remember it years later on because it's such a traumatic thing that they've just blocked it out. So it is really interesting to see actually the differences where they put the weight. Like one of the diaries that I'm just immediately thinking of is like Ilse Shatkin, whose diary is held at the Wiener Library. She writes on the 4th of September, like a really long entry about a boy that she fancies and how he had to move away, and she's moved to a different hostel. And then she's like, oh, by the way, war was declared yesterday. So you can really see like the kind of different weighting. And sadly, there was no oral history of hers, but if that would exist, I would be really intrigued to see like what the comment would be. And some comment on in their memoirs as well, or in their oral history on the diaries that they've had. I mean, I'm thinking of Vera Gissing, Powers of Childhood, but also Elisabeth Austin, who's written a memoir, sort of like, oh, how dumb was I to think this? Like, oh, like where did my priorities lie? So, but this is all like I think also due to the historical knowledge that came like later on. But yeah, thank you for the question.
If anyone else wants to respond to that, please do. Otherwise, I'll move on. Yeah, Howard.
I was going to say that, yeah, you've on the one hand, you've got the diaries which are written at the time, but and the memoirs tend to be decades later, but there's nothing kind of in between. So people, I guess, weren't really thinking about the situation, say, 10 or 15 years after the events because they're too busy getting on with their lives. But actually, it would have been a lot more fresher in their memory, and the chances are their recollection of what would have happened and their feelings about what was happening may have been more kind of mature and more more accurate or more valid sort of perspective on their experience. Whereas the later memoirs, if you say I'm talking like 50, 60 years later, there's always it's a danger and there's a tendency for people to have either forgotten things or not remembered things in the right way or whatever. I'm thinking of, say, what's the name, Mark Roseman's book, A Past in Hiding, where he kind of he's well, the basis of that book is he's interviewing a woman who's talking about her story as a child or a young teenager in Europe, in hiding from the Nazis. And during the course of his research, she passes away, but he finds a whole cache of diaries and letters that she'd written from the time, and then he starts to kind of revisit the transcript of his interviews with her and realizes a lot of the memories that she'd had or thought she'd either adopted from other people or that she, in some way, shape, or form, they weren't. She genuinely thought they were her memories, but they'd become sort of distorted and warped and adopted from other people's accounts, and so he was able to kind of reconstruct the narrative using the original diaries and the letters. It's quite an interesting sort of exercise in a way. But I doubt whether there were many Kinder who were starting to write, give memoirs just 15 years, 10, 15 years after the events, because they would have been far too preoccupied with getting on with life. I know that was definitely the case with my dad. In fact, he never wrote a memoir anyway, but I mean, he wouldn't have been bogged down with writing accounts of what happened to him during his childhood years. possibly partly because it was still very kind of painful to him, you know. So, but yeah.
Yeah. Um, I guess leading on from that question, we have another one. Is there any evidence that reflects the long-term impact of moving so far for the children, such as their overall development in education or emotionally? I don't know if any of you have seen evidence for this.
I can give this a start. I think it's really, well, it's not really quantifiable. I mean, there's obviously stories that you can read, and this is like sort of where it all comes down to the individual stories, because we're never gonna be able to read the stories just looking at Britain of all the 10,000 children that came over. So there's no like big data collection or Excel spreadsheet that we can make. So we have to look at the individual stories and like sort of evaluate them as they are. And you have some that, you know, came from middle class families and suddenly had to work in a completely different field. Like they had a trajectory of like maybe perhaps going to university and suddenly like something turned out really different. So it is really difficult to actually quantify this. And also, you know, who's to say they would have actually gone on to university or not done something else? So like, and with the disruption of war and everything around it as well, like there's too many different things that you need to consider here. But what we do see is obviously like sort of trends of people saying, oh, you know, like it took me longer to get where I wanted to be in life because of the Kindertransport and because like of my experience, because I didn't know English when I first arrived. Because yeah, like I was not able to go to school or I suddenly had to work. Yeah, but Amy, do you want to say something as well?
I think you summed it up really wonderfully. I would just add to that in the sense of now, as you've already hinted to in your work, you know, we've got the uh, a sort of official records that can track that displacement, and then if you put the ego documents on top of that, you can see patterns and other things that will evolve from looking at those combinations.
Thank you. I'll just take another question at random. While there will be archives relating to the larger organizations that accommodated the Kinder, how much research has been done gathering testimonies from families who either provided accommodation or were children in a household that cared for Kinder, such as the Attenborough family?
There has been, I mean, Howard will know this very well. You know, there has been some research. In hindsight, we should have started interviewing the foster families and you know, those young children who, you know, shared their homes with the Kinder, but also just generally people that the Kinder, you know, then were connected to, whether that be through evacuation or internment or so on and so on. You know, if you think about the sort of longitudinal approach and the, you know, thinking about a multi-perspective approach as well, you know, it would be amazing to interview anybody that was connected to a Kindertransportee to understand what they understand is the Kindertransport, how that has impacted, how they think it's impacted the Kindertransportee, how their stories has impacted them, you know, all these different things. There are published accounts of I suppose step siblings or foster siblings of the refugee children. We can, as Monja will be able to say, there are those documents from foster families. You know, there's this beautiful letter. I feel like it's in the Wiener Library. I know it definitely is. And it's a really reassuring, beautiful letter that says, "Don't worry, she's arrived. We know it's her birth and we've baked her a cake." And you know, those documents from the foster families are incredible to read all these years later. And I wish somebody could have interviewed them and said, you know, what was it like to receive this child? But then also, you know, as Howard has also talked about throughout this talk, those more negative experiences or those foster families that were not so welcoming and inviting, where, would they have come forward and, talked about how they treated children? So, yeah, interesting question though.
Yeah, I'm not sure how. I mean, I know definitely there are some accounts of um, foster parents, but I don't think they're that thick on the ground. It's mostly the kind of material that we've got is the letters for which the children have received from their parents, um, and sometimes a copy outgoing correspondence as well. Um, we got one amazing collection of two brother and sister who who actually their parents were the father had converted to Catholicism in 1911 quite early, so out of conviction. The mother, she converted to Protestantism in like really late in 1930s. She was a mathematician, he was a lawyer, and and they sent their children on the Kindertransport. Um, and the boy went to a Catholic boarding school, and the girl went to a girl, Catholic, convent school for girls, and she grew up to be a nun, and he grew up to be a priest. But and we've got their correspondence, that they received from their parents, and at the end of the war. I mean, miraculously, their parents managed to survive in hiding in Vienna. And at the end of the war, the parents came over. But of course, by that time, they would have probably been sort of mid late teenagers, and they were fully sort of anglicized and had no intention of, or didn't no desire to move to Vienna. But the parents wanted to go, continue their lives in Vienna, so they ended up sort of making their lives here out of choice, So they had the chance to be a family again, but they chose not to do it. So they become sort of fully anglicized. So that's quite a really interesting account, actually, really interesting collection. And in fact, it came to us through the Mother Superior of the convent, where the sister had been, um, you know, been living, and it was later because when she passed away, I managed to locate her brother, who was still he'd retired, but he's still around, and he was able to talk me through the archive and explain lots of the intricacies within the archive. That was really useful because his father was a really prolific writer. So there's a ton of correspondence in there, and Francis, the son, was able to sort of explicate that. So that was really useful and interesting. But that was the case of a brother and sister who'd come over, but they didn't show. I mean, Francis didn't show any kind of hallmarks of sort of damage or emotional damage or anything. Who knows? I mean, what do I know? But he seemed very kind of, in his twilight years, seemed very kind of, content with life and everything. And I didn't get a sense from it that his sister either had struggled that much. The two of them seemed to have maybe sort of finding religion, so to speak, as Catholics, had sort of given them some kind of sustenance. I don't know. But I don't think there is a kind of, there are these occasional stories, and sometimes they're very rich. Sometimes there's loads of correspondence, but you can't really generalize. That's the bottom. Can't really sort of say to what extent people suffered as a result of their experience because it is so variegated and so nuanced.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, very radically different trajectories, I think, for some of these Kindertransportees. Another question in the chat. Did the children in the Kindertransport scheme always know the situation that they were in? Was there much secrecy surrounding why they were being transported, or were they aware of the reasons why they couldn't stay in Germany?
I think it, as Howard mentioned earlier, it really depended on your age in a lot of cases. So, for example, Hannah Zach Miley was 7 when she came, and she has this like vivid memory of being in Holland and being told, "Where is your suitcase?" and like panicking and not knowing where it was and what it even looked like. And I told her the other day, I was like, "I've got these instructions about the trains and." Um, we were just talking about her testimony, and I said, in this sort of, sheet for parents, it says you have to drop off the luggage the day before, and it was 5 Reichsmarks. And if you wanted to add, it wasn't just this is another myth, this one case myth. You could actually take more, and it says that in the documents. If you wanted to take more, it was an extra 5 Reichsmarks. And this meant then it's what you could then afford, obviously, to take, because Hannah took a trunk, a box, 2 suitcases, and she was panicking that she didn't know where these things were. Well, obviously they'd been dropped off the day before, so she didn't know what they looked like, or all in the panic. And also at that point, that is when you were given the Kindertransport tag for the children to wear, because it correlated to the tag on the luggage. And she remembers just being told, do not take this tag off. This is, essentially your new identity, and this is how people will find you. And when she was on the train then coming up from London to Coventry, one of the committee members said, oh, take your tag off, it's fine. Like, and she as a 7-year-old, and then traveled all around the world and everything, has always kept on hold of this tag, which is really interesting. But for example, the youngest person that I found on the Kindertransport was 4.5 months old. There are 23 babies so far that I've counted who were born in 38 and arrived in 39. So, they arrived in Moses baskets. They would have had no idea. And so too, some of them arrived with their brothers who were 3. They wouldn't know anything about the preparation beforehand. But a 16-year-old would probably know a little bit more and have more of an awareness, particularly those. We have documents of some of the older boys who were interned in Dachau, Sachsenhausen and Buchenwald. And I can tell you what block they were in. And then they end up on the Kindertransport. So those boys would have had a horrific understanding of what this flight into exile meant. Different understandings, but I think they were, and a lot of them were told, we're going on a journey, it's exciting, first time you see the sea. Everybody remembers this moment, that watershed moment in Holland, and it's because they were told to keep the windows locked, and in Holland they were allowed to open them, and that says it in the documentation as well. And they were also given 1 Reichsmark for the journey for the tea carriage. Every train had a tea carriage, and the children could have a drink or something like that in there. So again, Hannah remembers nothing about that. She was 7, but an older child might.
Okay. I'll move on to the next question then, which I think picks up on the point Howard made. While I think there's some truth in the idea that people were too busy 15 years after the arrival of the children, isn't it more the case that the episode had yet to be historicized? The Holocaust wasn't yet called the Holocaust, and the possibility of framing oneself as part of a historical moment was really not available to their own consciousness. What do you make to that?
That's a fair point. I think it's. um, I just think people. Yeah, I mean, people are just too preoccupied in that part of their lives. In the 1950s, you're just starting out on, as young adults or in your mid-20s. There's not going to be the thought of sort of sitting back and reflecting on what's just happened 15 years previously. I just think would be kind of anathema to most people. And yet, it's true possibly that also that it's so close to the period that people hadn't begun to kind of use terms like Kindertransport or Holocaust and all the rest of it. Yeah.
Any other thoughts on that? Happy to move on if not. Okay, well, I think one audience member would be interested in hearing panelists' views about Nicholas Winton, uh, Kindertransport, This Is Your Life, and in particular, how much of a turning point it was. I'm inclined to feel it's overrated, but I'm happy to be overruled if necessary. Ooh.
I could come in here. I think I said this earlier, like with the film coming in, it's been nice to see the Kindertransports and like this whole sort of debate on child refugees and like from Nazism and all that entering the mainstream media, not just within the UK. I mean, it was like a stacked cast, right? You have like Anthony Hopkins, you've got Helena Bonham Carter, so it was like quite a big production. So like it's nice to see, but also like as someone who's actually working within that history, there's a lot annoying things. And like I remember sitting in the cinema and being like, but like this isn't right, and like, I don't like how they portray this, you know. So I think like there's good things to come of it, there's bad things to come of it, like with many things. Um, I also do personally think just thinking of them of the Winton children is always a bit sort of dismissing all the other people who have been involved in it. Like he's obviously played like a huge part, and I don't want to diminish anything that he's done, but also there were so many other people involved. And just sort of referring to them as the Winton children is sometimes not thinking about the other people who were involved. And I think with the if I think about the film poster and like his like Anthony Hopkins' face being plastered on it, is sort of like you have this different association. And again, that's obviously like a positive thing for them all being in the mainstream media, but also a negative thing in a way that it omits some parts of the history.
I think the film was really interesting in the fact that it sort of hinted to what wasn't shown. For example, like there was, these gaps in terms of, Winton himself didn't know necessarily what happened to the children until much later on. You don't really see their adaptation process sort of thing. And that is true in the sense of, well, Winton didn't really see that either in many regards. But I think what is interesting about that film and we know so much about those children and those particular rescuers. Obviously, all those that helped Winton as well, like Doreen Warriner, Trevor Chadwick, Malka, and so many other people. That story is so central to the Kindertransport story as a whole. But what is really interesting is that I showed you at the very start of the talk a sort of overview list of the Winton transports. Well, we found every single Winton Transport, I'm going to call them Winton Transports, lists now. And obviously the Winton list is online. That was put together after the fact. Winton did that himself. And there's 612 children listed on that list. In the document that's online, which is part of that overview list, it suggests that 669 children were rescued. The list that I have suggests 679 were. And then we also have children on the Winton list that are listed 3 times and they never leave. There are these two brothers that are listed multiple times on these lists and they never leave, and they're deported to Terezin and then murdered in the Warsaw Ghetto with their mum. So even like the nuances around like where the children were born, there's a little boy on the Winton list who escapes. He's born in Morocco. So, thinking around the Winton story, there's still so much more to uncover around that. Even though there's this really well-known film, we know a lot about it. Now that we have the actual Kindertransport lists, there's even more to unpick that with regards to that story as well.
Thank you. I think we'll do a couple more questions. Apologies to everyone else. There is here a sort of semantic question about the use of Kindertransport and or Kindertransports. I think of the Kindertransports rather than the Kindertransport, as there were different Kindertransport programs to different countries with different organization. And also one train is a Kindertransport, many trains over time are Kindertransports. What do you make to that?
No, it's a really interesting one around definition and terminology and just symbolism as well. I agree. Yes, that there are. We could argue that the Kindertransport is a British rescue scheme that happened between 38 and 1940 with that last boat coming over from the Netherlands. The use of that term in terms of multiple or plural Kindertransports is also true, and one transport is a Kindertransport in and of itself. So I agree with everything that I think Melissa said that question of the KTA. I agree with everything. You know, we should be using the terms Kindertransport and Kindertransport but also interchangeably as well. I think because that's what the documentation does. And for a long time, the Kindertransport, in a British perspective, was not known as the Kindertransport. It doesn't really appear in any of the British files. The term is really used in terms of the German, Austrian, and Czech files, but also, no, it's not even used hardly in the Czech files that I've seen, and in the Dutch files in particular. And in Holland, when you go to like Vught and Westerbork, the Kindertransport means you know, the horrible other side of the story. That's what it means there. So the definition and symbolism, it's so synonymous with rescue, survival, all of those things in the UK. It is less known, for example, in America, although it's very well known now in the sense of because of the KTA and other people. It's not necessarily as central in American Holocaust memory more broadly. We might think of the 1,000 children that went to America, although we know that there's more because we found the lists. And there were other sort of routes. There were Kindertransports from Vienna to America during the war, and they went through the Trans-Siberian Express. They went to Russia, Japan, and then on to America the other way around. And they had continued. And there's even a letter about, I think he's 2 or 4, and they're asking for this little boy to be sent on that route on a Kindertransport. The news comes back saying, no, he's too young. And as a result of that decision, he's not able to go, and he's tragically deported. But there were so. I agree. When we think of Kindertransport and Kindertransport history, we should refer to the Kindertransports, and then that sort of helps us understand that there were multiple versions. And obviously, a Kindertransport, one transport is that as well. I don't know if anybody else wants to step in.
Maybe just briefly, but I think it's a terminology question in and on itself, because in the scholarship as well, like you read something and you go from kinder to Kindertransport Refugees to Kindertransportees. So I think it's sort of like a bit of a personal preference, and it would be probably very helpful if scholars can agree on a shared vocabulary in a way. But I think Amy's got a point here, and just to add to that. Like as a German speaker, I'm also a bit like stumbling over saying Kindertransports, because in my head it should be Transporte with an E at the end. So it's sort of like this weird, because it's this sort of Germanized or well, no, anglicized word from German. And yeah, like I think it's a personal preference, but I do think there is a value of both, like because the Kindertransport as a sort of scheme in British memory is like this one big thing. Whereas like you've got the transports to all the different places, Sweden, Switzerland, America, like Amy already said. So just sort of to add.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, sometimes you just hear Kinder as well, which must sound very strange to a German ear.
And
Okay,
also,
so
just jump in because you were saying about the German. Kindertransport is used after the war, and it means the rehabilitation of Aryan children. But also, that's how I came to the Kindertransport history, because my dad was part of this post-war. He just had asthma and ended up in Switzerland, and it wasn't a Kindertransport, but it was all connected to this post-war like helping of children, and it was it's used in this very broad way. Nothing to do with our Kindertransport.
mm, thank you. Yeah, so I think final question I'll pose in a very broad way. What do you see as the future of studies into the Kindertransport? What are the challenges that still exist in terms of archives, documentation, testimony, so forth? It's a big question, but yeah, some brief thoughts.
I can probably start briefly, and maybe Howard can swoop in, because I think one of the big things, and it's already been said in the chat really, is to make the archives more accessible, is to actually like get the voices out there, and like you know, it's wonderful to see the engagement of like loads of second, third, like sort of future generations, which is incredible, but also people, young people, school children, the broader public just needs to have access to this history, and especially in a more like globalized world with lots of movement happening anyway, it would be really, really beneficial for like everyone to sort of, yeah, learn about this, not just in a British history sense, but also in a more transnational one. And this is sort of like, I mean, this comes back to all the discussions that we've had, even with the terminology, that like we need to acknowledge that Kindertransports happened in all various directions, and it's not just a British history, but it's an international history and a transnational one. And by opening up the archives and making them more accessible, they're not just going to be in those stuffy little boxes. And there are so many incredible things in the archive, not just diaries, not just letters, not just unpublished memoirs, but also items of clothing, shoes that they've kept, the labels. So it's really like nice to see what they've actually like kept, and it's very emotional seeing all these things. And I think like actually giving people the chance to see those kind of things is really, really valuable. And perhaps we also need to move it out of museums a little, like to make it more accessible, like bring it to the people rather than expecting the people to come. But don't ask me how to do that.
Yeah, I totally concur with what you're saying there, Monja. And we're doing our utmost, our darndest to do that. And of course, we've come on leaps and bounds. When I first started at the library 25 years ago, we just had card indexes and bits of paper. There was no internet. There was no online catalogs. There was nothing. So now we've actually got our own digital library. So more and more of our content is being uploaded and is searchable free to air via our website. Not everything, but a significant part of it is. And we've also got our catalogue, which is fully accessible online. But we're also taking in new collections all the time, every year. I mean, this year alone, I've already taken in 10 collections this year. And last year I took in 50 to 60, the same year before. So we're still acquiring more and more material. The issue is actually processing that material and getting it into a state where we can let readers access it, because that's the stumbling block. I mean, my main priority is to get the stuff in house, so it hasn't been thrown out, so protected from if someone contacts me and says they're interested in depositing something, I like to stop what I'm doing and take that in. I always prioritize that. If I put them off, I don't want them to sort of think, okay, they're not interested and they might bin it. So the first priority is to get it in house. But I definitely agree. And I think we've made a lot more material accessible to a wider audience at the library. And also, we have quite an active outreach program now where we've got 2 trained teachers who regularly get young groups of school groups coming in, and they regularly use sometimes original documents, but often facsimiles. So again, we're sort of exposing them to that content much more widely than we used to. So we're on it, but there's a lot more work to be done for sure.
I would say, as a researcher, I'm so grateful to the Wiener Library and the Leo Baeck Institute, because you guys are just so open. So, for example, our national archives have Kindertransport files. They have Kindertransport lists, for example, which I only accessed in America. The same files are there and they're open in America, but they're closed here for data protection rules, which I do understand, but it would be great to have more accessibility with archives, which you've both already touched on anyway. So the great advocacy there. I think also hopefully moving towards the 90th anniversary in the future there, the AJR are trying to launch a new Kindertransport database. So for example, all the Kindertransport lists would be there. So you click on England, Belgium, France, and then you click into all the different transports, and then onto the children whose profiles would appear, their ego documents, their interviews, anything else that they've got in any other document, or newspapers or anything like that. So this sort of family history appears. We could we'll be working with the Wiener Library and the Leo Baeck to hopefully yeah, push this forward sort of thing. So there's the database idea as well. And also the database will have blogs where, researchers can add to, what they've, how they've used the database and what they found and how that connects with their research. School children can. So I've just been contacted by schools in Germany and here who want to research children in their local areas and their lists. And see what happened to all these children. And I think how wonderful would it be to bring obviously that to the database so other academics could know about it. We cannot individually research 10,000 children, but gosh, all these other people can, schools, community groups, survivor groups, all those sorts of things. So again, making that accessible to the public as well, all these like other initiatives, not just from like the researchers sort of thing, and we can learn from them. I would also say that we've talked a lot about memorialization as well. So there will be new Kindertransport memorials coming your way, plaques, big national memorials, other types of memorials that we're hoping to launch for the 90th anniversary. So please keep that in mind. I'm also thinking about, the first generation is still here with us. We're memorializing something that is still ongoing in a sense because we have first generation. And again, a sort of plea, if you do know any first generation, AJR can help financially and support, and we are here for you as a community. And reunions, there are going to be so many more reunions now going into the 90th and what they look like, whether that be local, regional, national, transnational reunions. Thinking about first gen as well, there are going to be, I suppose, yeah, celebration of life, but also commemorating the losses as well and the children that could and should have come on the Kindertransport. There was a discussion in Parliament on the 8th of December to suggest that 50,000 children could have come on the Kindertransport to the UK. So we're going to be hopefully memorialising those children who were listed. They're not all listed, 50,000 listed, but some of those are listed in the list of people that didn't take place. So remembering the Kindertransports arrived, those potential sort of imagined Kindertransports that could have took place, that should have took place, and also Kindertransports in a very different direction. So we need to remember all of those together. And it, for the 90th anniversary, what an apt time to remember all these together, not just the Kindertransports beyond British shores, but in other directions too. So yeah, I think the future is really optimistic, and I think we can go in a more transnational route, but also nevertheless, think of the personal. And I think while we've got the survivors here, make the most of them, talk to them, interview them, tell us their stories, contact the archives, contact researchers, just sort of advocating for that, because without you, we wouldn't know as much as we do. So the future is bright, but the future is also needed with your help to move forward.
That's a great note to finish on, I think. So thank you once again to our three panelists for their fascinating insights. Thank you to everyone who attended, those of you who put comments and questions in the chat. It made this a really rich and interesting discussion. I enjoyed it very much. So thank you again. And we hope to see you at another of our events in the near future. So thank you all, and good night from me.